Welcome to the Cheating Diaries channel. Laura and I had always dreamed of exploring historical sites together. It had been our shared ambition since we first met in college, bonded by our mutual love for history. Our fascination with the past led us to countless discussions, late-night study sessions, and visits to local museums. Now, years later, we were finally turning that dream into a reality. We decided to start our journey in Europe, the cradle of so much history. Our first destination was London, a city rich with stories and landmarks. The anticipation built up as we boarded our flight from New York, an early morning departure that promised a day filled with excitement upon our arrival. As the plane touched down at Heathrow Airport, I looked over at Laura, who was practically glowing with excitement. She had never been to Europe before, and the prospect of walking through streets that held centuries of history was thrilling for her. I felt a warm sense of satisfaction seeing her so happy. This trip was as much for her as it was for me. We quickly navigated through customs and collected our luggage. The bustling city of London awaited us. Our hotel was centrally located, providing easy access to many of the key historical sites we planned to visit. After checking in and freshening up, we decided to take a short rest to shake off the jet lag before heading out. The first afternoon, we wandered around the city getting a feel for the place. Laura was like a kid in a candy store, pointing out every historical building and monument she had read about. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself just as eager to explore. That evening, we sat down with a map and outlined our itinerary for the week. We had booked several guided tours, eager to learn as much as possible about the rich history of each location. Our first official tour was scheduled for the next morning, and it focused on some of London's most iconic landmarks. As we settled into bed that night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Laura lay beside me, already drifting off to sleep with a peaceful smile on her face. This trip was off to a perfect start, and I was looking forward to the adventures that lay ahead. On our first full day in London, we were scheduled to join a guided tour that would take us to some of the city's most iconic historical landmarks. We woke up early, the excitement of the day ahead shaking off any lingering jet lag. After a quick breakfast at a nearby cafe, we made our way to the designated meeting point, a quaint square near the heart of the city. The square was bustling with tourists, all eagerly awaiting their respective guides. It wasn't long before we spotted a man holding a sign with the name of our tour company. As we approached, he greeted us with a warm, enthusiastic smile. "Good morning, I'm Tom, your guide for today," he said, his voice brimming with energy. Tom was young, probably in his early 30s, with an air of confidence and charm that immediately drew people in. He had a friendly, approachable demeanor and a genuine passion for his job, which was evident from the start. "Hi Tom, I'm John, and this is my wife Laura," I introduced us, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you both. We have an exciting day ahead of us, full of fascinating history and beautiful sights," Tom replied, his eyes twinkling with enthusiasm. As Tom began to gather the rest of the group, I couldn't help but notice Laura's reaction to him. She was captivated, her eyes following his every move. It was as if she had found a kindred spirit, someone who shared her fervor for history on a level that was rare to encounter. The tour started promptly, and Tom led us through the cobblestone streets of London, regaling us with stories of the city's rich past. His knowledge was extensive, and he had a way of making history come alive with his vivid storytelling. Each site we visited seemed to unfold like a page from a captivating novel. Laura was particularly engaged, asking Tom numerous questions and soaking up every detail he shared. She laughed at his jokes, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. It was clear that she was thoroughly enjoying herself. Our first stop was the Tower of London. Tom's narrative about its history, from its construction by William the Conqueror to its use as a prison and execution site, was both informative and engaging. He described the lives of the prisoners held there and the ghostly legends that lingered within its walls, making the ancient fortress seem alive with the echoes of the past. Next, we visited Westminster Abbey, where Tom's storytelling reached new heights. His descriptions of the coronations, royal weddings, and funerals that had taken place there over the centuries were so vivid that I felt as if I could see the events unfolding before my eyes. Laura was completely engrossed, hanging on his every word. Throughout the day, Laura and Tom developed an easy rapport. Their conversations ranged from historical facts to personal interests, and it became apparent that they shared more than just a love of history. They laughed together, exchanged anecdotes, and seemed to understand each other on a deeper level. By the time we reached our final stop, the Houses of Parliament, I couldn't shake a slight feeling of unease. Tom's charismatic presence had certainly made the tour more enjoyable, but the way Laura interacted with him left me feeling unsettled. There was a spark in her eyes, an admiration that I hadn't seen directed at anyone but me before. As the tour concluded and we made our way back to the hotel, Laura couldn't stop talking about everything she had learned. Her excitement was infectious, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. Tom had made a significant impression on her, and while I appreciated his knowledge and enthusiasm, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. That night, as we settled into bed, Laura was still buzzing with energy, recounting the day's highlights. I listened, smiling and nodding, but inside, a storm of emotions was brewing. I hoped that this was just a fleeting infatuation with a talented guide, but a part of me feared that it might be the beginning of something more complicated. The next few days would tell, but for now, I resolved to keep a close eye on how things developed between Laura and Tom. Our journey had only just begun, and already it was proving to be more eventful than I had anticipated. The second day of our trip began with the same excitement and anticipation as the first. We had another tour scheduled with Tom, this time exploring the rich historical tapestry of the British Museum and some other iconic landmarks nearby. As we walked to the meeting point, Laura was practically bouncing with energy, her excitement palpable. Tom greeted us warmly, and we set off toward the British Museum. As we walked, I started to notice subtle changes in Laura's behavior. She stayed close to Tom, peppering him with questions about every detail of the artifacts and exhibits. Her laughter was frequent, and she seemed almost overly enthusiastic at his jokes and anecdotes. In the Great Hall of the British Museum, Tom gave a detailed account of the significance of the Rosetta Stone, explaining how it unlocked the mysteries of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Laura was hanging on his every word, her eyes wide with admiration. She asked questions about the ancient cultures and their influence on modern society, engaging Tom in a lively discussion that seemed to exclude the rest of the group. As we moved through the museum, I began to feel a pang of unease. It wasn't just that Laura was interested in history, she always had been, but there was an intensity in her focus on Tom that I hadn't seen before. She seemed almost entranced by him, her attention unwavering. At one point, Tom led us to a section of Greek artifacts, where he animatedly described the mythology behind the statues and pottery. Laura stood so close to him that their shoulders almost touched. I found myself stepping back, watching the two of them interact with a growing sense of discomfort. After the museum, we headed to Covent Garden for lunch. Tom suggested a quaint little cafe known for its historical ambiance, and we all settled in for a meal. Laura chose to sit opposite Tom, and their conversation continued seamlessly. They talked about everything from the Roman Empire to Renaissance art, barely noticing the rest of us. I tried to join the conversation, but it was clear that Laura was far more interested in what Tom had to say. When he mentioned an obscure historical fact or made a witty remark, she laughed and looked at him with a spark in her eyes that I found unsettling. As the day went on, my suspicions grew. Laura's behavior wasn't just a fleeting interest in a knowledgeable guide. It felt like something more. There was a connection between them that was becoming increasingly apparent, and it left me feeling uneasy. That evening, after the tour had concluded, Laura and I walked back to our hotel. She was still buzzing with excitement, recounting the day's events and everything she had learned from Tom. I listened, trying to share in her enthusiasm, but my mind was elsewhere. "Tom is just incredible, isn't he?" Laura said, her eyes shining. "I've never met anyone who can bring history to life like that." "Yeah, he's passionate about what he does," I replied, forcing a smile. "He knows a lot." Laura nodded, seemingly oblivious to my discomfort. "I'm looking forward to tomorrow's tour. I wonder what fascinating stories he'll tell us next." As we reached our hotel room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Laura's admiration for Tom seemed to go beyond a simple appreciation for his knowledge. It was almost as if she was drawn to him in a way that made me feel like an outsider. That night, as Laura fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with thoughts and suspicions. Was I overreacting? Was this just a harmless infatuation with a talented guide? Or was there something deeper going on that I needed to be concerned about? I resolved to keep a closer eye on things. Laura and I had always been open and honest with each other, and I hoped that if there was truly something to worry about, she would talk to me. But for now, all I could do was watch and wait, hoping that my suspicions were unfounded and that our dream vacation wouldn't turn into a nightmare. The day's adventures left us both exhilarated and exhausted. After a short rest at the hotel, Laura suggested we take an evening stroll to soak in more of London's charm. The city was even more magical at night, with the historic architecture beautifully illuminated against the dark sky. We stepped out into the cool evening air, the streets buzzing with both tourists and locals enjoying the night. Laura seemed particularly animated, her eyes darting around, taking in every sight and sound. We wandered through narrow lanes and broad boulevards, passing by charming pubs, elegant theaters, and iconic landmarks. As we walked along the Thames, the reflections of the city lights shimmering on the water, Laura suddenly stopped and turned to me. "John, I have an idea," she said, her voice full of excitement. "How about we split up for a bit? There are a few places I've read about that I want to explore, and I know you're not as interested in them. This way, we can both enjoy what we like best." Her suggestion took me by surprise. We have always enjoyed exploring together and sharing our discoveries and experiences. The idea of separating, even for a short while, felt strange, but I didn't want to dampen her enthusiasm. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to hide my reluctance. "I mean, I'm happy to go wherever you want to go." Laura smiled reassuringly. "I know, but I don't want to drag you to places you might find boring. Besides, it's only for an hour or so. We can meet back here afterward and share what we've seen." Her logic made sense, and I didn't want to come across as overly possessive or distrustful. After all, it was just a brief separation. Still, a nagging feeling of unease settled in my stomach. "Okay," I agreed reluctantly, "but let's meet back here in exactly 1 hour, all right?" "Perfect," Laura beamed, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "See you soon." With that, she turned and walked away, quickly disappearing into the bustling crowd. I watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me trusted her completely, believing that she simply wanted to make the most of our time in the city. But another part of me couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. I decided to make the most of my time alone, trying to push my worries to the back of my mind. I wandered along the river, taking in the sights and sounds of the vibrant city. The London Eye loomed above me, its lights creating a mesmerizing pattern in the night sky. I passed by street performers and bustling markets, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Laura. What was she doing? Where had she gone? And more importantly, why did she feel the need to explore on her own? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. I found a quiet bench near the riverbank and sat down, staring out at the water. The hour seemed to stretch on endlessly, my anxiety growing with each passing minute. I checked my watch repeatedly, counting down the seconds until I could see Laura again. Finally, the hour was up. I made my way back to our meeting point, my heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. As I arrived, I scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of her. After a few tense moments, I spotted her walking towards me, a bright smile on her face. "John!" she called out, waving excitedly. "You won't believe what I found." She reached me and immediately launched into a detailed account of the hidden gems she had discovered, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I listened, trying to match her enthusiasm, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Despite her apparent joy, I couldn't help but wonder what else might be going on beneath the surface. As we walked back to the hotel, Laura's excitement was infectious, and I found myself momentarily swept up in her enthusiasm. But as we settled in for the night, the nagging doubts returned, whispering in the back of my mind. Something had changed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was taking an unexpected and potentially troubling turn. The next morning, we resumed our tour with Tom, this time exploring the historic neighborhoods of London. The city was alive with activity, and the weather was perfect for a day of sightseeing. Laura seemed particularly excited, her mood buoyant as we set off with the group. As we walked through the narrow streets of Westminster, Tom shared stories about the famous figures who had lived and worked in the area. Laura was, as always, fully engaged, asking him numerous questions and hanging on his every word. Her enthusiasm for history was one of the things I loved most about her. But today, something felt different. About an hour into the tour, Laura turned to me with a bright smile. "John, Tom mentioned some additional historical sites that aren't on the main tour. He's offered to show them to me after this. I think it would be a fantastic opportunity to learn even more about the city's history. Do you mind if I go with him?" I was taken aback by her request. While I appreciated her passion for history, it felt odd that she would want to separate from the group, and from me, to spend more time with Tom. However, not wanting to appear unreasonable or distrustful, I nodded. "Sure, Laura. If you think it's worth it, go ahead. I'll stick with the group and catch up with you later." "Thanks, John. You're the best," she replied, giving me a quick kiss before turning her attention back to Tom. As the tour continued, Laura and Tom occasionally drifted off to the side, discussing various historical facts and points of interest in more detail. I tried to focus on the tour and the information being shared, but my thoughts kept drifting back to them. There was a growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't ignore. When the main tour ended, Laura waved goodbye to the group and joined Tom for their additional exploration. I watched them walk away together, a knot tightening in my chest. I decided to take a leisurely walk through the nearby streets, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I found a cozy cafe and settled in with a cup of coffee, attempting to distract myself with some light reading. But my mind kept wandering back to Laura and Tom. What were they doing? What were they talking about? And why did it feel like she was becoming more distant from me with each passing day? An hour later, I received a text from Laura. "Hey John, Tom showed me some incredible places. I'm learning so much. I'll meet you back at the hotel in about an hour. Love you." I replied with a simple, "Okay, see you soon," trying to keep my tone neutral. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Laura's enthusiasm for history was genuine, but her growing closeness with Tom felt troubling. Back at the hotel, I waited in the lobby, my mind racing with thoughts and suspicions. When Laura finally arrived, she was beaming with excitement, her cheeks flushed from the day's activities. "John, you won't believe the hidden gems Tom showed me. We saw this incredible old church that dates back to the 12th century, and the stories he told about it were fascinating." She continued to share her experiences with me, her enthusiasm bubbling over. I listened, nodding and smiling, but my unease remained. Her connection with Tom seemed to be deepening, and I couldn't help but feel left out. That evening, as we prepared for bed, Laura was still buzzing with energy, recounting the day's adventures. I tried to join in her excitement, but a part of me felt like an outsider, observing from a distance. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of the city outside our window, my thoughts were consumed with doubts and questions. What was going on between Laura and Tom? Was it just a harmless fascination with history, or was there something more? I knew I needed to talk to Laura, to express my concerns, and try to understand what was happening. But for now, all I could do was wait and hope that my fears were unfounded, that our trip would bring us closer together rather than drive us apart. One evening during our trip, Laura suggested we invite Tom to join us for dinner. Her idea was met with enthusiasm from Tom, who seemed delighted by the offer. We decided on a cozy, charming restaurant not far from our hotel, known for its warm ambiance and delicious cuisine. As we arrived at the restaurant, the soft glow of the candlelight and the gentle hum of conversation created a relaxing atmosphere. We were seated at a corner table, giving us a bit of privacy, while still allowing us to enjoy the restaurant's ambiance. Laura had taken care of the reservations, and I could tell she was eager for the evening to unfold. Tom arrived shortly after us, looking relaxed and casual in a smart shirt and jeans. His smile was as charismatic as ever, and he greeted us warmly before taking his seat. The evening began with light conversation as we perused the menu, and Laura's excitement was palpable. She couldn't stop talking about the day's events and how much she had learned from Tom. As the dinner progressed, I watched the dynamic between Laura and Tom closely. They seemed to be in their little world, their conversation flowing effortlessly and their laughter coming easily. The way they interacted was comfortable and familiar, but it was the unspoken exchanges, the glances, and the small, knowing smiles that caught my attention. At one point, Tom recounted a funny anecdote about a historical mishap he had encountered during his career. Laura laughed heartily, her eyes locking with his for a moment longer than necessary. There was an intimacy in their connection that I hadn't noticed before, a subtle yet unmistakable chemistry that made me uneasy. Tom leaned in slightly, gesturing animatedly as he spoke, while Laura mirrored his posture, hanging on every word. Their proximity was noticeable, and every time Tom's hand brushed against Laura's as he reached for his drink or gestured, it seemed to linger just a bit longer than necessary. I tried to engage in the conversation, making an effort to include myself in their exchanges. I asked Tom questions about his experiences and shared some of my thoughts on the places we had visited, but it felt as though Laura and Tom were operating on a different wavelength, their conversation often slipping back to inside jokes and shared stories. Throughout the meal, I noticed Laura's gaze often drifted back to Tom. When he spoke, she looked at him with an admiration that went beyond simple interest. I couldn't ignore the way their eyes seemed to communicate something deeper, something that made me feel like an outsider in what should have been a shared experience. As dessert was served, Tom excused himself to take a phone call. Laura and I were left alone at the table for a brief moment. I seized the opportunity to voice my feelings. "Laura, is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "You seem very close to Tom." Laura looked at me, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Oh, John, it's just that Tom is so passionate about history. I enjoy talking with him. He makes learning so much fun." "I get that," I said, trying to mask my discomfort. "But I can't help but notice how much time you're spending with him. It's like you two have a special connection." Laura's expression shifted, a mix of defensiveness and confusion crossing her face. "It's nothing like that, John. He's just a great guide and a friend. I would have thought you'd be happy that I'm enjoying the trip." I tried to reassure her, but my mind was still preoccupied with the way she and Tom interacted. As the evening continued and Tom returned, the atmosphere seemed to shift back to its previous warmth. We finished our meal, and Tom bid us goodbye, thanking us for the dinner. Laura seemed in high spirits as we walked back to the hotel. She chattered about the evening and how much she appreciated Tom's company. I nodded and smiled, but my thoughts were consumed with the unsettling feeling that our relationship might be facing a challenge I hadn't anticipated. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind, trying to make sense of the growing distance between Laura and me. The connection she shared with Tom was becoming more apparent, and I couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in my heart. Our trip, which had started with such promise, was now fraught with uncertainties, and I wasn't sure how to bridge the gap that seemed to be widening between us. The sun was shining brightly as we embarked on another day of exploration. Our tour for the day was set to cover the historic landmarks of Greenwich, including the Royal Observatory and the Cutty Sark. I had been looking forward to this part of our trip, as it promised a blend of maritime history and scientific discovery. Laura seemed particularly excited as we met up with Tom and the rest of the group. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and she chatted animatedly with Tom as we boarded the tour bus. I noticed that their rapport was more relaxed than ever, their easy laughter filling the space between them. It was hard to ignore the growing sense of familiarity and closeness. Once we arrived in Greenwich, Tom began to lead us through the various sites. The group followed along, taking in the rich history and beautiful views. However, it wasn't long before Laura and Tom began to drift towards the edges of the group, their conversation becoming increasingly animated. At first, I tried to stay focused on the tour, snapping photos of the stunning views and listening to Tom's explanations. But as the day progressed, it became clear that Laura and Tom were becoming increasingly engrossed in their discussions. They ventured further from the main group, eventually finding a secluded corner near the Royal Observatory. Curiosity, and a growing sense of unease, compelled me to follow them discreetly. I kept my distance, hiding behind a large stone monument as I watched them interact. Laura and Tom were deep in conversation, their body language intimate and engaged. Tom's gestures were animated, and Laura's laughter seemed more genuine and carefree than I'd seen in a while. From my vantage point, I could see the way Tom leaned in closer to Laura, his tone personal and earnest. Laura responded with equal warmth, her eyes locked onto his with a look that seemed both captivating and affectionate. There was a sense of ease between them that was palpable, and it was clear that their conversation was private and meaningful. Tom's hand brushed against Laura's arm as he made a point, and Laura's gaze lingered on him longer than necessary. The interaction between them was undeniably intimate, and I felt a pang of jealousy and concern. It was as if their connection was deepening, becoming something that went beyond mere professional courtesy. I shifted uncomfortably, my heart racing as I continued to watch. Laura and Tom's exchange seemed to be a world unto itself, completely separate from the rest of the group. They were lost in their bubble, oblivious to the fact that I was observing them from a distance. Eventually, Tom checked his watch and signaled to Laura that it was time to rejoin the group. They reluctantly pulled away from their private conversation, and Laura seemed a bit flushed as she walked back towards the rest of the tour. Tom followed closely behind, his demeanor as charismatic and composed as ever. I approached Laura as she rejoined the group, trying to act casual. "Hey, you two seem to have a good conversation," I said, attempting to sound cheerful. "What were you talking about?" Laura smiled brightly, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Oh, just some interesting details about the observatory and its history. Tom has so many fascinating stories. It's amazing how much there is to learn." I nodded, trying to mask my lingering doubts. "I'm glad you're enjoying it. It's been a great day." As we continued the tour, I found it increasingly difficult to shake the feeling that something significant was happening between Laura and Tom. Their interactions were becoming more frequent and more personal, and it was clear that their connection was evolving in ways that made me uncomfortable. That evening, as we returned to the hotel, I tried to talk to Laura about our day, but the conversation was strained. Her mind seemed to be elsewhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the growing bond between her and Tom was starting to overshadow our own experiences. The sense of distance between us was becoming more pronounced, and I struggled to understand how to address the issue without seeming overly suspicious or confrontational. As I lay in bed that night, the events of the day replayed in my mind. The growing closeness between Laura and Tom was undeniable, and I was left with a lingering sense of unease. Our trip had begun with such promise, but now it felt like a delicate balance was tipping, and I wasn't sure how to restore it. The next day's tour took us through the historic streets of Oxford, a city renowned for its prestigious university and charming architecture. The weather was crisp, and the golden hues of autumn added a picturesque backdrop to our explorations. As we moved from one historical site to the next, I found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing distance between Laura and me, as well as her continued closeness with Tom. To distract myself from my mounting concerns, I struck up a conversation with another tour participant, Mark, who was also traveling with his wife. Mark was a friendly guy with an easygoing demeanor, and he had joined us on several tours throughout the trip. We found ourselves walking together through the picturesque streets, sharing observations and discussing the various landmarks. It was during this casual conversation that Mark brought up a topic I had been dreading. "You know," Mark began, lowering his voice slightly, "I couldn't help but notice how often Laura and Tom seem to be off on their own. They're always wandering away from the group and chatting about, well, things that seem a bit more personal than historical facts." I looked at him, surprised by his candidness. "I've noticed that too," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "They do seem to spend a lot of time together, more than what's necessary for the tour." Mark nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's not just you. My wife and I were talking about it yesterday. We've seen them together a lot, and the way they interact, it just feels a bit too familiar. I've been wondering if I'm reading too much into it, but it seems like they have a connection that goes beyond just being a guide and a tourist." His words struck a chord with me. I had been trying to make sense of what I was witnessing, and hearing someone else voice similar concerns provided a new perspective. "I appreciate you mentioning it," I said. "I've been trying to figure out if I'm just being overly sensitive or if there's something more going on." Mark shrugged, a look of empathy in his eyes. "It's hard to say for sure. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but the signs are there. Sometimes, it's better to trust your instincts, especially when something feels off." We continued walking through the historic sites, our conversation shifting back to the day's activities. However, Mark's observations lingered in my mind, amplifying the doubts and insecurities that had been growing since the start of the trip. Later that evening, as Laura and I settled into our hotel room, I tried to broach the subject again. "Laura," I said cautiously, "I had a conversation with Mark today. He mentioned that he noticed you and Tom spending a lot of time together, and it made me wonder if we should talk about it." Laura looked at me with a mix of surprise and confusion. "Mark noticed that too?" "John, it's nothing. Tom's been incredibly knowledgeable, and I've just been trying to learn as much as I can." "I understand that," I replied, "but it seems like the time you're spending with him is more than what's necessary for the tour. I just want to make sure everything is okay between us." Laura sighed, her expression softening. "John, I didn't realize it was bothering you so much. Tom is just a great guide, and our conversations are purely about history. I didn't mean for it to come across any other way. I wanted to believe her, to trust that her intentions were as innocent as she claimed. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing harder to ignore. The dynamic between Laura and Tom seemed to be shifting, and I was left grappling with my insecurities and fears. As we prepared for bed, I tried to push my worries aside, focusing instead on the remaining days of our trip. I hoped that by addressing the issue openly, we could restore some balance and understanding. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey was veering off course, and I was left uncertain about how to navigate the road ahead. It was a chilly evening in Cambridge, and the quiet of the city seemed to take on a different hue after dark. The day's tours had been both fascinating and tiring, and as we returned to our hotel, I was looking forward to a relaxing night. However, Laura had other plans. After dinner, Laura mentioned casually that she was going out for a nighttime excursion to explore the city's historical spots under the moonlight. She seemed unusually excited, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. I was taken aback by this sudden interest in a late-night adventure, especially since we had a full schedule for the following day. "Do you need me to come with you?" I asked, trying to mask my apprehension. "It sounds like an interesting idea." Laura shook her head, a playful smile on her lips. "No, it's something I want to do on my own. Tom suggested it, and I think it'll be really special. You should rest. We have another busy day ahead." Her response, though polite, felt dismissive. The fact that Tom was involved in this nighttime excursion only added to my unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As Laura prepared to leave, I decided to follow her discreetly, hoping to uncover more about what was truly happening. I waited until Laura had left the hotel before slipping out myself. I kept a safe distance, blending into the night as I trailed her through the dimly lit streets. The cool air nipped at my skin, but my mind was focused solely on tracking Laura's movements. Laura walked briskly, her excitement evident in her quick steps. She headed towards a quaint little cafe that I had noticed earlier, but hadn't paid much attention to. The cafe was known for its charming ambiance and was situated on a quiet corner, away from the main thoroughfares. As I approached the cafe from across the street, I saw Laura enter, greeted by a friendly nod from the bartender. I waited in the shadows, my heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. The cafe's windows were slightly fogged up, but through the gaps, I could see Laura and Tom seated at a small table in the corner, their conversation animated and intimate. Tom had taken off his jacket and was leaning in close to Laura, his body language relaxed and open. Laura, in turn, was smiling warmly at him, her attention wholly focused on their discussion. The interaction between them was unmistakably personal, and it was clear that their connection extended beyond the professional. I watched as Laura and Tom shared a dessert, their faces lit up with laughter. Tom's hand occasionally touched Laura's arm or lightly grazed her shoulder, and Laura responded with equal warmth, her gaze lingering on him with affection. It was a scene that felt intensely private, and my presence, though concealed, felt intrusive. The cafe was quiet, the soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of cutlery punctuating the scene. Laura and Tom appeared completely absorbed in their world, oblivious to the outside surroundings. They seemed to be enjoying each other's company, their interaction filled with a familiarity and ease that I hadn't seen before. After a while, Laura and Tom stood up, exchanging what looked like heartfelt farewells. Tom placed a gentle hand on Laura's back as he walked her to the door, and they shared a lingering goodbye before Laura left the cafe. I waited until she was a safe distance away before following her back to the hotel. My mind was reeling with the implications of what I had witnessed. The nature of Laura's interaction with Tom seemed far more personal than I had anticipated, and it left me grappling with a deep sense of betrayal and confusion. As I walked back to the hotel, I struggled to make sense of the situation. Laura's late-night meeting with Tom felt like a clear indication of something more significant happening between them. The trust I had in our relationship was being tested, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about Laura and our trip. When I finally returned to the hotel room, Laura was already there, preparing for bed. She seemed cheerful and energized from her outing, her eyes bright with excitement. "How was your excursion?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It was wonderful," Laura replied, her enthusiasm palpable. "Tom showed me some hidden gems of the city that I wouldn't have found on my own. It was a fantastic experience." I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." The tension between Laura and me had reached a boiling point, and I could no longer avoid addressing the issue directly. The recent events, especially Laura's clandestine nighttime excursion with Tom, had left me feeling increasingly uneasy. I needed answers, and I decided to confront Tom head-on. The next morning, after another round of historical tours, I found myself standing outside our hotel's lobby, waiting for Tom to arrive. He had mentioned earlier that he would be joining us for a brief overview of the day's activities before we set out for more sightseeing. I used this opportunity to address my concerns with him. When Tom walked into the lobby, he was his usual composed self, greeting me with a friendly smile. I could see that he had a spring in his step and a confident demeanor, but beneath that surface I sensed a hint of nervousness. "Tom," I said, catching him as he was about to head towards the tour group. "Do you have a moment? I'd like to talk to you about something." Tom looked at me, his expression shifting slightly. "Sure, John. What's up?" We moved to a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the bustling activity of the other tourists. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. This conversation was long overdue, and I needed to approach it carefully to avoid escalating the situation. "I've been meaning to ask you about your interactions with Laura," I began. "It seems like you two have been spending a lot of time together, and I'm starting to feel uncomfortable about it." Tom's smile faltered for a moment, and he shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Oh, I see. Well, Laura's been enthusiastic about the tour, and I've just been trying to help her make the most of it." "I understand that," I said, my tone firm but not confrontational. "But the amount of time you two have been spending together, especially outside of the scheduled tours, seems a bit excessive. I'm worried that there might be more going on than just professional interest." Tom's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced around the lobby as if seeking an escape route. "John, I assure you there's nothing inappropriate happening. Laura's been asking questions and exploring more of the city on her own. I'm just here to provide additional information and ensure she has a great experience." I studied his face, searching for any signs of deceit. "It's not just what you're saying. It's the way you both interact. There's a level of familiarity and warmth that goes beyond a typical tour guide-guest relationship. It's been hard for me not to notice." Tom's demeanor grew more tense, and he ran a hand through his hair, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Look, John, I understand where you're coming from, but I can assure you that Laura and I are just friends. My job is to make sure everyone enjoys the tour and gets the most out of their experience. That's all there is to it." His defensive reaction only heightened my suspicions. The nervousness in his voice, combined with his evasive body language, suggested that there might be more to the story. "Tom, if something is going on, I need to know. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but it's important to me that I understand what's happening." Tom took a deep breath and seemed to struggle with his words. "John, I can't control how people feel or interact. My role is to provide information and support during the tour. If there's been any misunderstanding, I'm truly sorry." His response was frustratingly vague, and I felt a sense of disillusionment. I wanted to believe his assurances, but his nervous behavior spoke volumes. It was clear that the situation was more complicated than he was willing to admit. "All right, Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I appreciate your honesty. I just want to make sure that Laura and I can continue to enjoy this trip without any additional stress." Tom nodded, his expression a mix of relief and discomfort. "Of course, John. If you have any more concerns, feel free to talk to me." As Tom rejoined the group, I was left standing in the corner of the lobby, feeling a mix of frustration and unease. The conversation had not resolved my doubts, and the tension between Laura and me continued to simmer. I was left with more questions than answers, and I knew that the remaining days of our trip would be crucial in determining the future of our relationship. The days had been heavy with unspoken tension, and the atmosphere between Laura and me had grown increasingly strained. My confrontation with Tom had only deepened my doubts, and I could no longer avoid addressing the issue with Laura directly. I needed to hear the truth from her lips, to understand what had been going on between her and Tom. One evening, after we returned to the hotel from another long day of touring, I knew it was time to have a serious conversation with Laura. I could see the fatigue in her eyes and the weight of our situation hanging over us both. We needed to confront the issues head-on if we had any hope of resolving them. We sat down in the quiet corner of our hotel room, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the only sound breaking the silence. Laura looked at me with a mixture of apprehension and resignation, her usual smile absent. I could tell she knew this conversation was coming, and she seemed braced for the impact. "Laura," I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. "We need to talk. I've been feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the way things have been between you and Tom. I need to know what's going on." Laura's gaze fell to her hands, which were nervously twisting in her lap. She took a deep breath before meeting my eyes, her expression a mix of guilt and vulnerability. "John, I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I'm sorry for the way things have unfolded." Her words felt like the prelude to something significant, and I waited in tense anticipation. "Laura, please, just be honest with me. What's going on between you and Tom?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching mine for understanding. "I've been trying to avoid this conversation, but I owe you the truth. I do have feelings for Tom. There's been a connection between us that I didn't expect." My heart sank at her confession, and I struggled to keep my composure. "Feelings? Laura, you've been spending so much time with him, and it seems like there's something more than just friendship. How long has this been going on?" Laura's eyes were filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly before continuing. "It started as a fascination with his knowledge and passion for history, but as we spent more time together, I started to feel something more. It's complicated, John, and I didn't intend for it to happen." I was silent for a moment, trying to process the weight of her admission. "So, what does this mean for us? Are you saying that you're considering leaving our family for him?" Laura shook her head vigorously, her voice trembling. "No, John, that's not what I want. I've been struggling with these feelings, making me question everything. But I love you, and I'm committed to our family. I don't want to throw everything away for this." Her words were a mix of reassurance and distress, and I could see the pain in her eyes. "Laura, it's hard for me to hear this. I need to know if you're truly committed to working through this with me. Can you honestly say that you're ready to put our family first and move past these feelings for Tom?" Laura's expression softened with sincerity. "Yes, John. I want to work through this. I know I've made mistakes, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix things between us. Tom is a part of my past now, and I want to focus on our future." The intensity of her confession left me with mixed emotions. While her words provided some comfort, I couldn't ignore the reality of what had transpired. Trust had been shaken, and rebuilding it would take time and effort. "I appreciate your honesty, Laura," I said, my voice hoarse. "But this won't be easy. We need to address the issues in our relationship and find a way to move forward." Laura nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand, John. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. I love you, and I don't want to lose what we have." As we embraced, the weight of the conversation hung heavily between us. The road ahead would be challenging, and there were no guarantees of a smooth resolution. But in that moment, we were united in our desire to confront the difficulties and rebuild what had been strained. We had taken the first step towards addressing the truth, and while the future was uncertain, the willingness to face it together offered a glimmer of hope amidst the turmoil. The revelation of Laura's feelings for Tom had cast a shadow over our marriage, and the tension between us had reached a boiling point. One evening, after a particularly draining day of sightseeing, we found ourselves in a heated argument. The conversation, initially about mundane matters, quickly devolved into a confrontation about our future. I was overwhelmed with anger and betrayal, demanding answers about how we could move forward. Laura, equally distressed, struggled to defend her actions, while trying to express her remorse and commitment to our marriage. Our discussion revealed deep-seated frustrations and divergent views on our path forward. I questioned whether our relationship could ever regain its former trust and intimacy, feeling that Laura's connection with Tom had irreparably damaged our bond. Laura, on the other hand, was grappling with guilt and fear, torn between her emotional turmoil and her desire to repair our relationship. We both recognized that our current approach was leading nowhere and only escalating the conflict. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, we agreed that we needed professional help to navigate our predicament. The realization that we couldn't resolve these issues on our own led us to decide to seek couples counseling. This decision marked a tentative step towards healing, with the hope that a therapist might provide us with the tools to address our problems constructively and help us determine whether our marriage could be salvaged. The final days of our historical tour were marked by a palpable tension that hung over every interaction. Laura and Tom made a concerted effort to avoid each other, their attempts at maintaining professionalism starkly contrasted by the unspoken tension between them. Despite their efforts, it was clear that the sparks from their previous encounters were still evident, and their uneasy avoidance only highlighted the unresolved emotions that lingered. As we completed the last few excursions, the atmosphere remained strained. Laura was visibly uncomfortable. Her attempts to engage with the tour and with me were often marred by a sense of guilt and apprehension. Tom, too, seemed affected, his usual enthusiasm tempered by the weight of our unresolved issues. The end of the tour was a relief, but it left us with a sense of unresolved conflict and the daunting task of addressing the ramifications of what had transpired. As we boarded the flight home, a heavy sense of uncertainty lingered between Laura and me. The emotional strain of the trip had left its mark, and our return to the familiarity of home felt like a stark contrast to the turmoil we had experienced. The unresolved issues from our trip weighed heavily on us, and I could not escape the growing realization that our relationship was at a critical juncture. Once we arrived home, the reality of our situation set in with a new intensity. The comfort of our familiar surroundings did little to alleviate the tension between us. We both knew that a serious conversation was imminent, one that would determine the future of our relationship. The path ahead was unclear, but it was evident that addressing the core of our issues was essential if we were to move forward, either together or apart. Back home, Laura and I knew that the time had come for a decisive conversation about our future. We sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of our recent experiences hanging heavily in the air. It was clear that we needed a structured approach to navigate the complexities of our relationship, so we agreed to seek the help of a family therapist. Both of us recognized that professional guidance would be crucial in helping us understand whether we could salvage our marriage or if it was time to part ways. The decision to consult a family therapist marked a pivotal moment in our journey. It provided us with a sense of direction and a glimmer of hope amidst the uncertainty. We committed to giving ourselves the necessary time and space to work through our issues, understanding that the road ahead would be challenging, but potentially rewarding if we approached it with honesty and dedication. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on new videos.